Let's talk about the bones of the skull. One of the things that surprised me a lot when I was first learning anatomy is that this thing that we think of as our skull is made out of so many bones. Believe it or not, you don't even have to learn all the bones that the skull is made out of in AP 120. We'll just be talking about the really big ones. But all of those bones that you need to know about are on page 52. Now, they're organized into cranial bones and facial bones. That's the way anatomists think about it. But that's not a question I'm going to ask you. I'm not going to ask you, is the parietal bone a bone of the cranium or the face? I won't ask you that, right? So again, this is one of the things where you are walking around with your own study guide. So let's start at the top. Let's start at the frontal bone. Remember the frontal section? The frontal section, you ended up with the front part and the back part. This is the front of your head, and this is called the frontal bone. So yay for that, right? There are sinuses, little air sacs inside of the frontal bone, but I will ask that on the quizzes for the respiratory system. So you can draw a little pencil line through that for the time being. The parietal bones. The parietal bones are these bones right here. You've got, when you're an adult, you've got one frontal bone and you've got two parietal bones, one on each side. Ooh, let me give you a little bit of orientation on the pictures in your textbook and the pictures in your lab manual. In each case, the set of skull images from your textbook, from your lab manual, they are colorized. And the way they are colored, any individual bone is the same color in every image that you look at. And this is really useful. Let me give you an example. Let's look at this bone, the sphenoid bone. Like the sphenoid bone, that's like behind my eyeballs. Yes, it is. But look, see that purple color? That is also part of your sphenoid bone. So if you were to pick up a skull and look at it underneath, you can see the sphenoid bone. But that's not all. If you take the top of the skull off and look down inside, you can see that the sphenoid bone kind of looks like a bat. And these colorized images allow you to orient yourself on different bones as you go to different parts of the skull, different ways of representing the skull. Now, I should make the point that the colors that are used in your lab manual are different. The lab manual is not made by the same publisher. So in your lab manual, this bone isn't purple, it's orange, but anyway, you get the point. All right, so let's look at the parietal bone is blue. Let's see if we can find it. There we go. This is a good way to look at the parietal bone. Frontal bone here, parietal bone here. Right? Now the temporal bone. The temporal bone, we ask you to know quite a bit of detail about it because it just happens to be a very important bone. All of the fancy equipment that allows you to experience hearing is found in the temporal bone. And so there are different parts of that bone that you need to know. By the way, aside from these lectures that I'm doing, I have specific lectures just about these particular topics that I showed you where to find them for the appendicular skeleton. All right, so let's talk about the temporal bone. The temporal bone is a complicated structure. So remember, we're looking at this sort of pretty coral orange color. Okay, so you can just barely start to see it here. And so I remember that the temporal bone kind of makes up my temple, right? Now, I don't know if you know anyone who has a clicking jaw or a jaw that locks or something like that. But if you ever, particularly close to exam time, end up with pain right here, then it's probably because you're grinding your teeth. And when we grind our teeth, we are going to be grinding our mandibles against our temporal bone. And exactly what part? So it is difficult to see it on this image. Oh well. But The arms of your jaw, mandible, form a joint with this area right here, the mandibular fossa. And by the way, there's a little meniscus in there as well. Let me see if I got a better, here you go. So here you can see, here's your jaw, that's your mandible, and it's going to articulate in a part of the temporal bone. I don't really love the way this is represented here, but that's what we got, right? So the mandibular fossa. The external acoustic meatus. You know, if you put a Q-tip in your ear, it kind of goes down into your skull because it's going into the external acoustic meatus. The external acoustic meatus goes down to the middle ear, and all of that is inside of your temporal bone, along with your inner ear is inside the temporal bone too. Alrighty, the mastoid process. Oh, the mastoid process. So right here, if you feel right, your skull right behind and under your ear, there's a bump on your skull, and that is called the mastoid process. Your neck muscles kind of attach to that bump there, the mastoid process. The styloid process. Anything styloid means to them it looked like a writing pen, and here you go. That is a lovely styloid process, and there are muscles that attach there as well. Now, I need to talk to you about the zygomatic process, so be patient with me. See this green bone right here? This is your cheekbone, okay? Your cheekbone right here in the front, this is going to be the zygomatic bone. The green bone's the zygomatic bone. Let's go back here. Zygomatic bone, right? And your zygomatic bone, as it goes back and it gets to about here, it comes in contact, see right there? It comes in contact with the temporal bone. And so this little part right here is called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, because it's the part of the temporal bone that reaches out to touch the zygomatic bone. Right? So this is your zygomatic arch, your cheekbones are your zygomatic arch. If I ask you which bone is your cheekbone, though, you should say zygomatic bone. Alrighty, zygomatic bone. So all of those things are parts of the temporal bone you need to know. What's our next bone? The occipital bone. This back part of your head is the occipital bone. So frontal bone, parietal bones, temporal bones, occipital bone. Right? And the occipital bone is this kind of purpley blue color. What do you need to know about in the occipital bone? Two things. This is a very large hole in your skull. And if you translate the word large hole into Latin, you get Foramen Magnum. They literally called the big hole in the skull the big hole. They just did it in Latin to make you think they were smart, right? Magnum means big. And foramen is always a hole in a bone, right? You already learned that from last week. So the foramen magnum. Now, on either side of the foramen magnum, these are occipital condyles. Okay, remember last week we learned what a condyle was. I told you a condyle is a knobby articular region, a knobby part of a joint, right? So condyle, there are two of them. Occipital because it's on the occipital bone. Right? Now, this is important. Please write it down, underline it, highlight it, something, because I'm pretty sure it's going to be on the next quiz or something. This is where the first bone of your neck, which is called the atlas, this is where the atlas attaches to your skull. So you know how your skull is attached to your neck. We're all appreciative of that, right? Right there on those two little spots, that is where your skull is attached to your neck, specifically to the first bone of your neck, which you will learn is called the atlas. Okie dokie, occipital bone. All right, ethmoid bone. We will get back to these bones of the face in a minute. The ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is this little delicate kind of pink color. And you'll see that if you look up in your nose, you've got a thin sheet of bone that divides the right side from the left side of your bone. It's called your nasal septum. And the upper part of that right here, and also these scrolls of bones inside the nose, are made up of the ethmoid bone. That's not all of the ethmoid bone, but it's an important part of the ethmoid bone. And that is specifically the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. The lower part of that nasal septum is made up of the vomer bone. The vomer bone is this kind of hot pink color. I've got a better image of that. Let me show you. Okay, here the skull has been caught in a mid-sagittal section. And with the mid-sagittal section, now you can see this is the opening. Your nose would be kind of attached here, right? Okay, and this is that bone between the two sides of your nose. The upper part is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, and the lower part is the vomer bone. Now, the ethmoid bone can also be seen from the inside of the skull, and this is what we very often ask you about, so make sure you understand this. On the inside, the brain is actually touching this area called the cribriform plate, and this little bump here, that's called the crista galli. By the way, crista galli means the rooster's comb. You know how roosters have that floppy thing on their head? I don't know what cribriform plate means, but the cribriform plate has got little tiny holes in it. So if a smell goes up your nose, that smell, whatever it is, lands right there and comes in contact with special nerve cells that carry it to this part of your brain right here, which is going to allow you to process odors. All right. The sphenoid bone. You know, we already talked about the sphenoid bone. I made a big deal out of it. It does kind of look like a bat, the sphenoid bone. In AP 120, when we ask you about it, we usually look at this right here, or we might ask the question, what bone contains the sella turcica? That'd be a good question. I should write that down. And the sella turcica literally means the Turkish chair. Turkish chairs you might see in some kind of a movie where they have people from the 1600s ruling the Middle East, and they sit in these chairs that are upholstered and have their, anyway, they thought it looked like that. The sella turcica is where your pituitary gland sits. And we have now started talking about the endocrine system, and the pituitary gland is a part of your endocrine system. And it sits right there in the Turkish chair, in the sella turcica. The sella turcica is in the sphenoid bone, right? Okay, so we have gotten through bones 1 through 6 on the skull. I am going to jump from there to the facial bones in the next video.